like to welcome you to the Prioritizing the Common Core State Standards book study. Several educators have asked me what prompted me to write this new edition of my 2003 book, Power Standards. And what I've said to them was the fact that when the Common Core State Standards came out, they had been advertised as being fewer, clearer, and higher. And I knew that the prioritizing process had been so applicable to state standards for the past decade, owing to the fact that there were so many of those standards in every single state that I had visited. So my curiosity piqued when I wanted to find out how many standards there actually were in these Common Core State Standards, thinking that if there were truly fewer, then the need to prioritize those standards would no longer exist. And it was very interesting because after all these years, we used to literally count the numbers of standards in the different content areas and all the grades K-12 in the many states that I visited, and we usually found the numbers of those standards to be well up into the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even into the hundreds. And when you think about the learning challenges that students face to acquire this many standards and really be able to demonstrate proficiency of those standards, the numbers became daunting. And for that reason, the prioritizing process was always very well received, and it really did help educators see the power of going through those standards to identify those that they felt were truly the most essential for students to learn. State standards did need to be prioritized because of the voluminous number of them. And when you think about the need for teachers to teach those standards, assess their students on those standards, and then be able to reteach and reassess those same standards, it was clear that the necessity for prioritizing would be there. The Common Core State Standards, however, present a very new challenge for educators, and that challenge is the fact that they have been organized so that each grade level's standards become the prerequisites for the succeeding grade. So what that actually means is that teachers realize that these standards need to be mastered prior to students leaving that grade, and in order for them to be ready to enter the next grade. So what is the rationale for prioritizing the Common Core State Standards? First, it's really important to remember that these standards have been internationally benchmarked to high-performing countries around the world. And the fact that these standards are vertically spiraled from one grade to the next means that it's going to really be important for educators to focus deeply on individual standards that will help students achieve the goal of having all those standards, as I said earlier, mastered by the end of the grade level. Over the years, I've found that there is a persistent misconception that exists about prioritizing the standards, whether they be state standards or even the Common Core. And that perception is that it is a dumbing down or lowering to the minimum of what we expect our students to know and be able to do. Nothing could be further from the truth. So I would just encourage you to always be on guard for the misperception that prioritizing means eliminating certain standards in favor of others. Because of the way the Common Core have been built, the fabric of these standards is such that all of the standards are important, and they all factor into making sure that students are truly ready for college and career by the end of their K-12 schooling experience. So the challenge for our educators is to really sharply focus instruction, assessment, and curriculum design on those standards that represent the end game, those standards that are the most rigorous and comprehensive, not the ones that are the most foundational. And so the way to identify these most rigorous standards is simply to have educators sit down together, read the standards, talk about the standards, think about the implications in terms of how they would prepare students to be successful at the next level of learning, and then identify those particular standards through this prioritization process that truly would enable students to have those assured competencies that they need to be successful at the next level of learning. If you would like more information about the rationale for prioritizing the Common Core Standards, please refer to Chapter 1 of the book. So we're talking about the rationale for prioritizing the Common Core state standards. One of the things I would ask you to do now is to spend a few minutes looking through the book and examining the figures, the tables that I have included in the book, which show the numbers of English language arts and math standards. And then at that point, to really be asking yourself two critical questions. One of them, is there enough time, instructional time in any given school year for students to adequately receive instruction on each of these standards, be assessed on each of these standards, be retaught the standard if they are not yet proficient, and given the opportunity to be reassessed on that standard? And the other question to ask yourselves is, are all of these standards equal in terms of the degree of emphasis you would need to place on them instructionally? The next question I'd like you and your colleagues to explore is the actual definition of priority standard. What does that mean to you? And if a standard is not identified as a priority standard, then what would you call that standard? So please pause the video, have that discussion, and then we'll come back for a little bit more on that subject. Hopefully during your discussion, you identified some of the key attributes of what priority standards are. So just briefly, I'd like to go over a couple of those thoughts and we'll see how closely we match up. One of the definitions that I've used for priority standards is the fact that they are a subset of the total list of standards for each grade level. And those standards in that subset represent, as I mentioned earlier, the end game. The standards that are the most rigorous and the most comprehensive. And often it's been interesting because in the days of power standards, with state standards, we used to talk about identifying the standards that were considered the most foundational. The ones that teachers would often say, all kids need to know and be able to do this. But what's different about the Common Core and about the priority standards definition as related to the Common Core is the fact that we're not looking for the most foundational, we are looking for the most comprehensive, the most rigorous, the standard that would represent, as I've said a couple times now, the end game, where students would really need to be by the end of the year. Those are the priority standards. Those are the standards to emphasize the most through instruction and assessment throughout the school year. Those other standards that are not designated as priority standards are called supporting standards. These are the standards that support, connect to, or enhance the priorities. They are taught within the context of the priority standards, but they do not receive the same degree of instructional emphasis. Oftentimes, those supporting standards represent the ones that students will need to progress through in order to attain the more rigorous endgame priority standards. Teachers will use those supporting standards as instructional scaffolds to help the students get to that end destination. Once people agree that the priority standards do need to be identified, the next question that obviously comes to the fore is, well, how do we identify them? What are the criteria for identifying certain standards to be emphasized more than others? I would like you to talk with your colleagues about what you think those criteria should be. So let's spend a few minutes doing that, and then we'll come back together and I'll give you my thoughts on that subject. During your discussion, hopefully you came up with some of the established criteria for prioritizing the Common Core. Those three in particular are endurance, those concepts and skills that will last over years and possibly an entire lifetime. Leverage, which simply means if students are able to demonstrate a skill in one area of the curricula, could they transfer or leverage that same skill in another area? And the third, and the one that is most often cited, not only with regard to state standards, but also with the Common Core, is readiness for the next level of learning. Which standards really do represent those prerequisites that students will need in order to enter the next grade level prepared for success at that grade level? The other criterion that might have come up during your discussion is that of external tests. What do students need to be successful on the upcoming PARCC and Smarter Balance assessments that are being created at present and implemented for the first time in the 2014-15 school year? These 4 criteria, endurance, leverage, readiness for the next level, and also the consideration of external exams, are the established criteria for identifying power standards and also priority standards with the Common Core. In the content area of mathematics, there is one additional criterion that does need to be considered when prioritizing the math standards. Do you know what that criterion is? Take a couple moments and talk that over with your colleagues. Did you identify the critical areas of focus as being that other criterion for prioritizing the Common Core math standards? The critical areas of focus are located in the preambles of each grade level Math Common Core state standards, kindergarten through 8th grade. What these critical areas of focus do is to identify where instructional time should be most emphasized. And as groups are prioritizing the Common Core state standards in mathematics, they will continually refer to these critical areas of focus as another lens through which they look to identify the Common Core state math priority standards. One last little discussion point that I would like to ask you to consider is the prioritization of the 612 literacy standards. These are the standards that secondary content teachers, science, technical subjects, history, social studies, will be needing to infuse into their instruction along with their content standards. Please take a few moments to discuss how secondary content teachers might prioritize the 612 literacy standards to include with their content standards during instruction. For more information about prioritizing the 612 literacy standards, please refer to the related section in Chapter 2 of the book. There are just a couple of points further I'd like to bring your attention to as you continue your book study. One of the questions that I get asked very frequently is, what about those who are not involved in the initial selections of the priority standards? How do we get their input and their buy-in? It's really important to create a sense of shared ownership for the ultimate final draft of these priority standard selections. And when you read Chapter 4 of the book, this chapter is all about involving others in the process, and I think you'll find it very informative as you consider how to implement these ideas in your own system. And I hope this chapter will be very useful to you as you consider how to involve others in your school system so that you truly do achieve a sense of shared ownership about the final selections of your priority standards. One final point I would like to leave you with concerns the success stories of people who have already prioritized the Common Core state standards. Where are these districts? Who are they? How do we get in touch with them? There are 6 chapters I've included in the book that provide narrative summaries authored by the leaders of those districts about how they successfully prioritized both the English language arts and the Mathematics Common Core. I hope you will find those chapter summaries very useful to you as you consider and continue doing this work in your own school system.